What if I told you that just 2.5 miles from shore, at 180 feet below the freshwaters of Lake Michigan, lies a 200-foot ship that could potentially have a treasure worth upwards of $890 million? This is the Westmoreland on Below the Surface. The Westmoreland was a passenger steamer built in Cleveland, Ohio in 1853 and made entirely of white oak. She had a very distinguishable pair of arches on either side of her called hogging arches, which made her very recognizable to anybody that saw her. Unfortunately, she had a series of misfortunes and issues before finally ending up at the bottom of Platte Bay in the northwest corner of Michigan just 1 year after she was built. After it was built, the Westmoreland steamed across Lake Erie from Cleveland, Ohio to Buffalo, New York, where it would receive its first assignment to sail from Buffalo to Chicago, Illinois. Before she could ever start her journey, the Westmoreland had a cylinder failure just outside of Buffalo on the Niagara River. She was eventually repaired all the way over in Menominee, Michigan, before making her final stop in Chicago. However, before she could make it to Chicago, she had yet another issue, this time fracturing her crankshaft. They repaired the ship in Chicago and loaded her up and sent her back on her final voyage to Buffalo, New York, with stops in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and Mackinac Island up in northern Michigan. She was carrying 34 passengers and cargo, including provisions and pay for the soldiers on Fort Mackinac. Then, on December 7th, 1854, during a blizzard, and before the Westmoreland could ever reach Fort Mackinac, she sprung a leak in one of her steam pumps. Everyone on board, including passengers and crew, formed a bucket line in attempts to bail the water out, but it proved to be not enough, and the ship took on water faster than they could get rid of it until her engine shut down and she was eventually taken by the rough waters. As the ship went down, the passengers and crew were able to evacuate the ship via lifeboat. It was said by survivors that while the Westmoreland was going down, it accidentally tipped over one of the lifeboats, dumping 15 people into the water. Unfortunately, those 15 people were lost with the ship. The remaining survivors worked their way towards land, but unfortunately, yet another 2 people passed away when the lifeboat crashed up on shore. The remaining 17 were now stranded on land and forced to walk 40 miles to the nearest town. What made this even more difficult was the fact that this was all during a northern Michigan blizzard. 20 years after it sunk, Paul Pelkey, the first mate of the Westmoreland when she went down, returned to look for the ship. It was said and reported that Paul Pelkey had eventually found the ship, and a crew was able to salvage her engine and boiler. It wasn't for another 60 years until another group went out to look for the Westmoreland. Max Knoll and Jack Brown linked up with a captain and Michigan resident, George Waters, to go and look for her. Captain Waters knew Paul Pelkey, the first mate, personally, and also claimed to know the exact location of the ship. The 3 claimed to have found the wreck using some prototype diving gear and described the wreck as a bunch of debris and broken up boards. Both Max Knoll and Jack Brown, shortly after finding the Westmoreland, co-founded Desco, a company that would eventually become one of the largest diving equipment companies in the entire world. 20 years later, after Max and Jack had claimed to find the Westmoreland, and now totaling 100 years after she had gone down, yet another expedition took place to find her. Captain Harold Van Nieman, yet another Michigan native, also had claimed to find the Westmoreland and said that it was buried in sand. He even went as far as saying that he was able to bring back a barrel from the shipwreck when he found it. A year later, Captain Van Nieman was arrested on charges of fraud brought on by his investors who had claimed that he had never actually went down to the Westmoreland or never used the funds as he claims he did. Several others from the 1950s all the way into the 2000s had gone looking for the Westmoreland but had never found her. Then, on July 7, 2010, after years of searching for her, Ross Richardson was scanning the waters of Platte Bay in search of the Westmoreland when he saw a very large and familiar-looking object on his sonar screen nearly 200 feet below the surface. The image showed a large ship sitting perfectly upright on the bottom of Lake Michigan with some very distinct arches on the side of it. A few days after finding the ship, Ross returned with his brother to dive the site. They hooked onto the wreck, and Ross slowly descended down the very clear but very cold waters of Lake Michigan. Reaching the bottom, the water temperatures being 39 degrees, Ross was able to very clearly see the ship's bow. With upwards of 100 feet of visibility, he was able to see and explore much of the ship. He continued from the bow of the ship, went towards the back, when he was able to see the hogging arches, thus confirming that he had finally found the Westmoreland. Continuing on his search of the ship, Ross was very curious about one thing, and that was whether or not the ship's engine and boiler were still in place. As he made his way to the stern of the ship, Ross discovered that both the engine and boiler were still intact. This would mean that Paul Pelkey, the first mate of the Westmoreland, never actually found her or salvaged her engines and boilers, and despite any other reports or findings that no one else had ever found her to begin with. This would mean that Ross Richardson was the first person to find the Westmoreland and the first person to lay eye on her in over 150 years. Due to the fresh water and the very cold temperatures at the bottom of Lake Michigan, the ship was very well preserved and intact. There is even a very accessible access point through a large hole in the bow of the ship, as found by diver Bob Epsom shortly after the Westmoreland was discovered. Bob was the first person to enter the ship, and he even discovered a hole in the deck that would lead you to the storage area of the ship. This portion of the ship still has yet to be explored. This finally brings us to what the Westmoreland possibly holds that could be potentially worth upwards of $890 million. The ship carried many things, including muskets, flour, provisions and other supplies, pay for the soldiers at Fort Mackinac in the way of gold coins, and whiskey. While some of those items might make for great antiques or other artifacts if recovered intact, there are two items that make up for the bulk of the value, those being the gold and the whiskey. To much surprise, the gold on board, if found, is estimated to be worth close to $20 million in today's money. $20 million in gold is certainly impressive and worth the trip to try to find it, but not nearly as impressive as the possible $870 million worth of whiskey if they're able to bring it to the top. But how do we arrive at that number? Whiskey that has been found and recovered from shipwrecks, or has been nicknamed the banished bourbon, has drawn the attention of whiskey enthusiasts all over the world. In fact, there was one bottle of whiskey of many that was salvaged off of another ship off the coast of Scotland that sold at auction for around $17,000. But that was just one bottle. On the Westmoreland, there is said to be 280 barrels full of whiskey on board. With these 280 barrels, that could yield over 50,000 individual bottles of whiskey, which is how we arrive at our potential $870 million worth of value. There are a lot of ifs here, though. There is no doubt that a successful salvage operation would bring about an impressive sum of money, but there is a lot that has to happen before we can even get to that point. First, we have maritime laws. There are very, very strict rules and laws in place for taking things from shipwrecks. Getting cleared by the state of Michigan is a task as tall as the salvage itself, if not taller. If cleared by the proper legal channels, then a salvage team would have to be hired to get the whiskey. Ross Richardson, the man to find the Westmoreland, has stated that if a salvage operation were to occur, that it will be done by a professional team to ensure everything is handled with proper care and done ethically. Once a team is hired, then they would need to get to the barrels of whiskey. We know that there is an access point to the cargo hold of the ship, but this has still been left unexplored, so no one knows the state of it. If divers are able to get into the cargo hold, they would then need to find the whiskey barrels and then slowly lift them to the surface one by one. It hasn't been said before, but diving at such great depths takes very careful skill and consideration. At these depths where the Westmoreland lies, a diver might only have 10 to 15 minutes of total time at the bottom to do what is needed. So getting all the barrels up would be a huge task. If all of that is successful, then there is a matter of just how many barrels would be salvageable. Of the 280, it's unlikely that they all made it, but the conditions of the Westmoreland give us hope that most of them may have. Once the salvage team is able to get some barrels to the surface, they would then need to test them to see if they've been contaminated by lake water or if they're even safe for consumption. Whiskey barrels by nature are waterproof and seal further as they age, but these barrels would have been underwater for 150 years, so little is known to how much could have affected them. However, they have been sitting in fresh water that holds a temperature of 39 degrees without seeing any sunlight, which could prove to be the perfect preservation environment. Say we get this far, the barrels have been tested, the whiskey has been bottled, and now they go to auction. We know from a similar instance, a single bottle sold for around $17,000. But what would a bottle from the Westmoreland go for? Certainly the rules of supply and demand would be in play here, as there would be hundreds, if not thousands of bottles, but these would surely be a rare bottle with a very strong story behind it. There have been a few local Michigan distilleries that are interested in the Westmoreland whiskey if it does come down to it and a salvage operation proves to be successful, so we might actually get to find out what they are worth. Would you ever drink whiskey that came from a ship that sank over 150 years ago in 180 foot of water? Or what would you even pay for a bottle like that? The last thing to consider is the ethics of the whole thing. After all, 15 people did go down with the ship and another 2 passing away when everybody made it to shore, making this shipwreck a grave site. Would it be morally right to take from it under any circumstance? Regardless of what happens with the cargo or its treasures, the plan, according to Ross Richardson, is to salvage any artifacts that they can from the ship and put them on display in a public museum, free for all to see and remember the Westmoreland by. I hope you enjoyed the story. Thank you for watching, thank you for listening, and if you have any shipwrecks you'd like to cover, let me know. This was the Westmoreland.